two-term Reagan administration was coming to a close, and the first year of the Bush administration was about to begin, Gore Vidal returned from his home in Italy to address a town hall meeting in Los Angeles in a talk entitled, "A Patriot Returns." In this talk, Vidal reveals what he feels are the true intentions of America's founding fathers when they designed the Constitution. Primarily, he believes the Constitution was designed to protect the property and power of those who already had it. But first, Vidal begins by sharing with us an encounter he had with one of America's power brokers, Mr. Thornton Bradshaw, then president of the Atlantic Richfield Oil Company.
I do many cultural things, and I am very often on such highbrow programs as Merv Griffin. And I was on the other night with Mr. Thornton Bradshaw, who was at that time the president of Atlantic Richfield Oil. And I told Merv, I said, you know, he wanted me to stay on during Mr. Bradshaw's spiel, because I'd done mine earlier, and I said, but listen, you got to let me ask him a question. Oh, yes, said Merv with an insincere smile. So suddenly, there is Merv in the middle, and Mr. Bradshaw is over there, and I'm over here. Well, the camera comes in for a two-shot of Merv and Mr. Bradshaw, and I am now exempted from this high-toned debate. So Mr. Bradshaw was, I think, plangent is the word, as he described the difficulties of being a wealthy oil company in today's world. And tears were streaming down Merv's face, and I'm punching him like this. Let me in, I want to talk. And Merv, I could hear him gasp as he would hit his kidney, but he didn't move. So finally, driven by righteous wrath, I reached out my arm and I went snaking around in front of Merv's face. Now, the camera had to explain what this arm was. So the camera pulled back and we became a three-shot. And I said, Mr. Bradshaw, do you feel ARCO is overtaxed? Oh, he said yes. He said, forget, you know, this special tax on profits, which is obscene. He said, well, I mean, we're so taxed, we can't dig for oil. Or do solar energy, which I know you like, Mr. Vidal. Well, we love that, too, but we haven't any money left over after taxes. I said, well, that's very funny, because in 1979, ARCO paid less than 10% on its corporate profits. You should have paid about 42%. You only paid 10%. I said, well, what do you want to pay? Do you want to pay 5%, 2%? Do you want to pay no tax at all? If you heard the program, you heard his answer, and if you understand it, tell me afterwards. Then I asked him, by then, he was getting very suspicious, and we were in the commercial break. He turned to me and he said, I went to Exeter, too. And I said, Mr. Bradshaw, the old school tie stops at the cathode tube. I said, you're on your own out here. And then I asked him, how much does it cost you to get a barrel of oil out of American ground, take it to your refinery, process it, take it to your own pumps? I said, we won't go to monopoly aspects, but how much does it cost you? Well, then he was very beady-eyed. He said, you mean old or new oil? Well, we did that dance. So he said, well, I don't really know. He said, you know, the price of oil changes. It's about $30 a barrel now. I will tell you that we make maybe 2 cents profit on every barrel of oil. I said, Mr. Bradshaw, your nose has just grown another inch. I said, according to your company's report to the Security Exchange Commission in the last quarter of 1979, I said, you confessed that it only cost you $6 to get a barrel of oil out of American ground, process, and get it into your own pump. So it's that 500% profit. I think you're doing very well. I'm going to buy some ARCO stock. He did not speak to me after that. He is now the head of RCA. And there goes my Lincoln project on NBC. These are the sacrifices we make pro bono publico. Anyway, after I'd do my Susskind performances, I'd go across the country speaking to as many different audiences as I could. It was my impression then, as it is now, that the average American is remarkably shrewd when it comes to his own interests. I think it's safe to say that any fuel supplier in Marietta, Ohio, knows more about the American economy than any American president in recent years. But I also found then, and more now, that thanks to a public educational system that collapsed some 30 years ago, even the most naturally intelligent of our people tend to be dangerously ignorant. And the word ignorant comes from the Latin, which means not knowing. Since history is nothing but propaganda in the schools, no bright kid in his right mind will bother with the stuff he's fed in class. They have good detectors. Geography is not taught at all, and so half of our college freshmen cannot identify the United States on an unmarked map of the world, while a humorous minority likes to place Moscow at the Panama Canal. I guess that large continent above and the one below and the small section in between seems suitable. Languages other than English do not exist, and very few college graduates can make themselves clearly understood in our beautiful language. Science for non-specialists is now so limited that 90% of our population thinks that the sun goes around the earth. It is no wonder that we cannot compete economically with Western Europe and Japan, where the educational systems are light years ahead of ours. Worse, even if we wanted to catch up, we've lost 3 generations. Who will teach the teachers, who are as ignorant as those whom they teach? Concerned citizens who live in freedom's land and bravery's home full time do not see the changes that those of us who divide our time between home and other countries see. I have watched in my lifetime the United States go from a very deep depression into a world war, into a world empire that for a time gave us the military and economic hegemony of the earth. From 1945 to 1950, that's only 5 years, we were the first and probably the last absolutely global empire. With the loss of the Korean War and the rise of McCarthyism in the United States, we began our descent. Now, for an aging patriot to return to New York City, the glittering world capital of my youth, is like a visit to a third world capital. There is poverty of a sort unknown, let's say, in Italy, where I spend part of the year. There's violence on a scale unknown in European countries, and poverty in harsh juxtaposition with arrogant wealth of a sort that in any less docile society would be pre-revolutionary. Many years ago, I abandoned decaying New York for rising Los Angeles, which has now this year proudly assumed the title of murder capital of the Western world. Naturally, none of this is our fault. It's their fault. Who are they? Well, communists, welfare mothers, liberals, and so on. The level of political discourse in the United States, and I watched solidly for 2 weeks, I think they called it an election. I watched for 2 weeks, and the discourse is now of a stupidity that I would not have dreamed possible when I cast my first vote in 1948. How did this happen? What to do? Eleanor Roosevelt used to tell me that you can only accomplish, if you're lucky, one bit of new information in a speech. She assumed that interested citizens were able to absorb at least one thing that the press and the general climate of opinion did not want them to know. And she always criticized me for trying to do too much. You bring up too many subjects. You must repeat and repeat and repeat, she said. Well, I shall try not to bore you with too many repetitions. And I shall stick to her advice and zero in on one subject which I want you to think about. A subject that is paradigmatic of all our problems. Let us consider the patriarchal state versus the liberal state, or if the word liberal is too darkened for you, the state of diversity. The word patriarchal, as you know, comes from the Latin pater patris, meaning father. A patriarchal state is one where the state, that is, father, knows best. Our specific founding fathers were definitely on the patriarchal side in life and deeply hostile to democracy. But when it came to the federal Constitution and its sublime afterthought, the Bill of Rights for all, the founders rejected paternalism. After all, what was a king but the father on earth, anointed in heaven to rule his sons? We began by rejecting king, and we replaced him with a loose oligarchy and a republic in which men of property might do well, and the others were at least protected as federal citizens by a Bill of Rights that could give them some redress. In due course, other amendments freed the slaves and admitted to the franchise every adult. Simultaneously, the patriarchal faction, in the name of conservatism and strict constructionism, set out to abolish as many of the citizens' rights as it could. In the name of conserving the Bill of Rights, political reactionaries have worked to eliminate the Bill of Rights. This is a most famous joke, but it's at our expense. I never thought I'd live so long as to hear a president go before Congress and talk about abortion, something that does not concern a federal government whose sole task is the protection of persons and property and the promotion of the general weal. The collection of taxes and the dispersing of those revenues is the only legitimate task of government. Since our system has always tended to corruption, reformers must arise periodically to remind government that it is not in itself an end. Today, political corruption, thanks to the cost of elections, is now total. Fortunately, the coming depression will make the current system irrelevant. So let us regard what will remain once there is no more money for our 4-year, issues-less, mindless presidential elections. What's left will be the patriarchal society. Our people appear to be convinced that the government has every right to decide with whom they can have sex, whether or not they can have an abortion, take drugs, and require them to chant prayers and slogans in the schools so reminiscent in their tone of the Third Reich. Our self-styled conservatives now regard the bedroom and the larder and the hospital ward as the government's province. But they do not believe that government has any right to police those who make money by, let us say, poisoning a river that endangers the health of millions. And they will fight to the death to remove all restraints on profit, even though people and forests and water systems die. That is conservatism, or so they call it. I call it decadent patriarchalism of a sort that traditionally spins off into dictatorship and chaos. The philosopher David Hume observed 2 centuries ago that, quote, as force is always on the side of the governed, the government has nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded. Now, this is an absolute truth. Even a Hitler or a Stalin had to keep the faith with at least to the stormtroopers or the KGB in order to govern. Once their opinion changes, no more dictator. The rulers of our country have been most shrewd from the beginning in screening out any ideas that might loosen their grasp. At first, opinion was shaped by the pulpit and the schoolroom. Obedience to the going superstitions of the society were instilled from McGuffey's reader on. Those were simpler times. Then came the rise of newspapers, general literacy, and the owners knew exactly how to exploit them. You know, in more than half a century of reading the mainstream American press, I have yet to read a story that reported any good news of any other society. If Swedish education and daycare centers are better than ours, it is because half the population must periodically commit suicide. Thanks to two large oceans, Americans were for a long time perfectly isolated from what was happening in more civilized countries. We were also doing pretty well here, and so who cared? Then came television, and the rulers handled that nicely by limiting all interviews on prime time to 6 minutes, making it impossible for anyone to explain anything. They have also, one by one, shut out critical voices. The result is an uninformed country living in a kind of bubble, where despite visible poverty and crime, everybody's assured 1,000 times a day that this is the greatest country on earth. Meanwhile, a year ago, one of the cornerstones of our liberties was smashed by the Supreme Court when preventative detention was upheld. Anyone who might one day, in a court's eyes, commit a crime can be imprisoned now before he commits a crime without due process of law. Opinion was hardly outraged. Now we're faced with mandatory blood tests, urine tests, lie detector tests, all in the interest of protecting us from AIDS or drug addicts or communism or something. The other night, before I went on the Johnny Carson show — there are no cultural events that I do not swiftly attend — I got an extremely embarrassed call from NBC asking me to bring my passport to prove that I was an American citizen. I said, well, I happen to have a passport. What about — a lot of Americans don't have passports. They may not need them. They don't travel. Well, they must bring a birth certificate or something. This is a federal ruling. I said, what about foreigners? They must show that their visa or green card is in order. I said, where did this come from? They said, well, 5 months ago, it came from the federal government. It applies to everybody who appears on any national television program. Well, I got somewhat exercised. Carson, by the way, hadn't heard about it, so I started asking about it. And they said, well, it has something to do with illegal Mexican immigration. I said, well, it is well known that as soon as an illegal Mexican crosses the Rio Grande, he's immediately booked into the Tonight Show, depriving American entertainers of a livelihood. Now, if you think of such restraints on our freedom as freedom, you're very welcome to that. I think of this as tyranny of a sort that, unless stopped now, will mean the control of every citizen at the workplace and in private life by a patriarchal government sustained in the media by opinion. To stay in power, this sort of society must invent prohibitions of a mindless sort generally, and they must then enforce them. Some of you can remember, as I do, from 1919 to 1933, they prohibited alcohol. The country then went illegal and pretty alcoholic. Eventually, the law was repealed, but a lot of damage was done. Now we prohibit drugs. By what right? Drugs are a bad thing, but I certainly have every right to kill myself with drugs in a free society, if that's what I want to do. A patriarchal society, however, prefers that it kill you rather than you kill yourself, as you belong to Daddy. In the last election, drugs, quite rightly, were a big issue which no one dared address, because opinion has already been cast in cement. That's why no candidate could say that all of the drug traffic and most of the addiction would cease if the profit motive was eliminated. No profit in drugs, no playground push-up. That's pretty simple, isn't it? That is what civilized countries do or try to do when we're not leaning on them. But we live here in this strange bubble. Legalize drugs, wouldn't that be communism or something? So we prohibit. And because we prohibit, we make more and more money for drug wholesalers and retailers. We have corrupted our police, our politicians, and even the CIA, whose leader, whatever his name may be, will be here, has been known to take a flyer or two in the drug trade. I suspect that there is now too much of an American investment in drugs worldwide ever to do something so sensible as eliminate the whole thing through legalization. Heroin, of course, comes to about 10 cents a shot. That heroin will kill in time is a risk that would be made clear with the skull and bones on the label, as we do with other poisons. But to change anything brings us back to our old friend opinion. On this subject, opinion has been so cleverly and so ruthlessly manipulated that no one can talk sense to the people. Drugs have been demonized, and that's that. And this patriarchal government is thrilled to have in its hands so many legal weapons with which to control the entire population. The government does not care whether or not the citizens live or die. Take a walk down Melrose. But the government wants to be able to silence its critics. And what better way than blood, urine, lie detector tests? And if the critic does not fail the test, results can always be rigged. Currently, we have 1 million people in prison in the United States. Only the Soviet and South Africa, on a per capita basis, can make this proud boast. No wonder that George Bush, looking ahead to further controls, wants to use unused army camps as prisons. Why not 10? Why not 20 million people put away? And plenty of drugs for those with money. You get my drift. We are a small country. We have fallen permanently behind Japan, and by 1992 we shall be behind Western Europe as well, economically. We are badly governed, badly educated. We are without patriots, as far as one can determine, from our political process at least. But then, ironically, patriots in a patriarchal society are dangerous, and so are made into non-persons. Anyway, it would be nice if people like you with influence were to do something to help change opinion. Otherwise, things will only get worse. And our country, whose high noon coincided with my own youth, will slip off the stage of the world forever. Maybe this will be a good thing, for the world anyway, but I can't see it. But then my opinions were formed in a free society.
You've been listening to a talk by Gore Vidal entitled A Patriot Returns, given at a town hall meeting in Los Angeles in November of 1988. In this talk he gave in June of 1990, entitled Patriarchal State of the Union, Vidal defines a patriarchal state as a state in which the patriarch or father knows best.
Thomas Jefferson, this is where it all begins. Some ambitious American colonists, as we approached the 4th of July, most of them were lawyers, I'm afraid, wanted to separate from England. Although there were no polls in those days, as far as we can tell, most people did not care one way or another whether they paid tax to London or to Boston, or preferably to nobody at all. But lawyers are not like other people. They are, as Henry II said, perpetrators of quarrels, makers of slogans, no taxation without representation. Lawyer Jefferson, they said, write us a declaration. You know, something high-toned, preferably 18th century. He did. all by himself, he created the idea of the American Revolution as opposed to the less glamorous and certainly less noble business of who pays tax to whom. We would together constitute a new nation founded upon life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You may well whistle. The first two foundation stones were familiar, if vague. After all, what is liberty? Liberty from what? Liberty from everyone else? From decent opinion? From accountability? That debate goes on. But the notion of freedom from tyranny is an ancient one, and everyone thinks he knows what Jefferson meant, including dreamy Tom himself. But the pursuit of happiness is the real joker in the deck. To this day, no one is really sure just what Jefferson meant. But I suppose what he had in mind was government will leave each citizen alone to develop as best he can in a tranquil climate to achieve whatever it is that his heart desires with a minimum of distress to the other pursuers of happiness. This was a revolutionary concept in 1776, and it still is. With a single phrase, Jefferson had upped the ante and made our republic, in name at least, more human than any other. Eventually, we freed ourselves from England, thanks to the French fleet. At the end of the struggle, there was George Washington and hardly anybody else except the lawyers. They were excited by the prospect of a new nation with new laws and an exciting, complex judiciary in need of powerful advocates and prosecutors and interpreters. Henry II's nightmare came true in a highly legalistic constitution that excluded from citizenship women, slaves, Native Americans, and the poor. The Constitution, as opposed to the Declaration, was designed to serve those white men of property who feared monarchy almost as much as they feared democracy. Hence our famous checks and balances that make it certain that no one can ever become king while the people at large are effectively excluded from government. That is why today, unlike most first world countries, we have many elections, but no politics. Was struck. Although the founding fathers were to a man natural conservatives, there were enough Jeffersonian-minded pursuers of happiness among them to realize that so lawyerly a republic would probably act as a straitjacket to those of an energetic nature. So to ensure the rights of each to pursue happiness, the Bill of Rights was attached to the Constitution. In theory, henceforward, no one need fear the tyranny of either the state or of the majority. Certain of our rights, like freedom of speech, were said to be inalienable. But a significant minority has never accepted so much freedom for so many. That is why from 1776 to the present day, the real ongoing drama of our republic has been the relentless attack of the prosperous few upon the rights of the restless many. Certainly the current Supreme Court is dedicated to the removal or alienation of as many of our inalienable rights as possible on the specious ground that what the founders did not spell out as a right is not a right at all, but some sort of unpatriotic, un-American activity. They like to remind us that a right to privacy cannot be found anywhere in the pages of the Constitution or even in the Federalist Papers. So in Utah, state law says George may not sleep with Jane, who is not his wife, while if he should sleep with Jim in Georgia, the state has a right to put them both in jail. We are told that since the Constitution nowhere says that a citizen has the right to have sex with another citizen or to take drugs or to OD on cigarettes or, as the nation is now doing, on sugar, the founders did not license him to do any of these things or indeed anything proscribed by the prejudices of a local majority. This is a wonderfully duplicitous argument, and our current court plays the dumb Dora game with real skill as it goes about imposing what has always been, until now, the impossible dream of the few, a patriarchal state. It is also the origin of the word patriot, someone who serves the fatherland. Where does the notion of the father as chief of chiefs come from? Obviously from the prehistoric evolution of those tribes where the father was absolute in his powers over everyone else in his family. From this tribal conceit derives monotheism, the idea of a single God creator whom we invariably depict as a man who has created at least half of us in his image. Actually, we created him, or our forefathers did. Was the United States meant to be a patriarchal society? I think the answer is no. Was the United States meant to be a monotheistic society, Christian or otherwise? The answer is no. Religion may be freely practiced here, but religion was deliberately excluded from the political arrangements of our republic. Unfortunately, the zealous few are always busy trying to make the many submit to their own religious superstitions. In the 1950s, they won a great and illegal victory over the Constitution. The rapture of being saved. The notion of one God may give comfort to those in need of a daddy, but it reminds the rest of us that every totalitarian society based on one-man rule descends directly from the concept of God the Father. From that notion came Hitler and Stalin, one paternal God, one paternal leader, and the rest of us are children to be told what to do. Authority is absolute, and error, as the Roman Catholic Church tells us in private, error has no rights. Each year it is discovered with some alarm that high school students, when confronted anonymously with the Bill of Rights, neither like it nor approve of it. Our society has made them into true patriots. But not of the idea of a free society, but of a stern patriarchy, where the police have every right to arrest you for just about anything that Dad disapproves of. To me, the tragedy of the United States in this century is not the crack-up of an empire we never knew what to do with in the first place, but a collapse of the idea of the citizen as someone autonomous, whose private life is not subject to orders from above. Speech is theoretically free, but the true pulpit electronic or print, is pretty much denied anyone who does not support the patriarchal state and all its misdeeds at home and abroad. It is no wonder, the story we've all read recently, that 2/3 of those citizens under 40 have no interest at all in public affairs. They know that they are helpless. They know that they are really participants in the governance of the country, that they have no role to play, and that they are simply administrative units. Where did we go wrong? I would put the time and place as the White House in 1950. Harry Truman and his advisors decided that it would be a good idea to keep the United States on a full wartime basis, even though there was no enemy anywhere on earth who could challenge us militarily or economically. So an enemy had to be invented. The dictator Stalin fitted the bill. So did atheistic and godless communism as a rival religion. But, said a Republican senator to Truman, if you really want to waste all that money on the military, you're going to have to scare hell out of the American people. So with a lot of help from Congress and from the likes of Henry Luce, Truman did just that. The Russians are coming, he cried. We are in mortal danger. Abroad from an expanding, invincible Soviet Union, at home from anyone who dares criticize what the American government is doing to the American people. As a result, since 1950, there has been no connection between the government, which represents the nation's corporate interests, and the people at large, who are not represented at all. There is no difference between the Republican and Democratic parties, which means that there is no instrument whereby the people might be able to assert themselves and make known their will. Should we try a third party? Well, we did in 1968. The People's Party, as well as Peace and Freedom. Were we effective? No. Because we hadn't realized that to have a third party, you must have two other parties. We also found out that political parties, as opposed to spontaneous movements, are not possible in an oligarchy as entrenched as the one that rules us. From George Washington to George Bush, the oligarchy only grows stronger and more resilient and more oppressive. For 40 years, it amused our rulers to pretend that we were in imminent danger of destruction at the hands of a second world country called Russia, and by an ideology called communism, which is translated by the FBI and the CIA, meant anyone who dared criticize our national security state and the defense budget. Why in 1950 was the decision made that we must always be at war with someone or other forever? One reason was understandable, if mistaken. We had made our recovery from the depression of the 1930s only when the Second War put everyone to work. So rather than run the terrible risk of a free economy where General Motors would have to make something people wanted, like a car, we decided to take all the revenues, 2/3 anyway, of the federal government and put them into armaments. The second reason for our garrison state is obvious: profits for the few. There's a third reason, but I don't think anyone in 1950 was quite aware of its consequences. A garrison state, forever at war, hot or cold, is easily governed and controlled by the few. Unlike a relatively free society of the sort the founders had in mind, where the governors are accountable to the people at large and to law. Today, the neglected, ignored people have got the point. Half the electorate now sensibly refuses to vote in presidential elections. After all, was there any difference between Dukakis and Bush? Admittedly, Dukakis did not seem to mind too much if Kitty was raped by black prisoners on furlough, while Bush thought that the flag was just grand, even if it was made in Taiwan. This was all good fun. In the end, there was a difference, by the way, between the two. Dukakis wanted to increase the Pentagon budget by $2 billion and Bush by $4 billion. Only Jesse Jackson said that if the defense budget was not severely cut, there would be no country worth defending. But that sort of substantive politics is not allowable. I think the point has now been well taken that if one wants a successful political career in the United States, the one subject that one must never address is politics. Like a broken record, I shall continue. A proposal which would, I think, correct the great corruption. No candidate or party may buy time or space in the media. Give free media time and space to all candidates. Limit national elections to 6 weeks, which is more or less what every civilized country does. This could all be changed by a single act of Congress. But it is amazing how those who got elected under that system do not want to change it. Can the two parties, which are really one party, be put to use? No. They are the country's ownership-made carnival. Can the united action of individual citizens regain control over the government? I think so. But it won't be easy to riot in understatement. Attempts to cut back the war budget, whether the war be against communism or drugs or the people, will be fought with great resourcefulness. When challenged with the billions of dollars wasted or stolen from the Pentagon, the establishment politician's answer is very clear. Abortion is against God's law. He promptly changes the subject, the way a magician does when he catches your attention with one hand while he's picking your pocket with the other. It is interesting that no one in Congress or press has ever opened up the defense budget and exposed the vast ripoff, not to mention mind-boggling corruption. Notice how on Ted Koppel, whenever this is brought up, somebody always says, but of course, yes, there's trouble in the defense budget, but the real problem are the people programs. That's where all the money is wasted. This is not true unless you count Social Security as ordinary revenue, which it isn't. Government is simply who collects what money, from whom, to be paid out for what. The founders made that central to the Constitution, and they gave the House of Representatives the exclusive power to see who gets what money. But since any close scrutiny of the government's waste and corruption is now too dangerous to allow, Congress has surrendered its constitutional function to the infamous Graham-Rudman Rube Goldberg automatic budget cutter. And so the corruption serenely continues and the state drowns in red ink. Constitution also made it plain that no president was ever to be trusted with the power to make war or peace. But the presidents, abetted by Congress, have long since abandoned the Constitution. In the last half-century, we have fought perhaps 40 wars
hot and cold, covert and overt, without a single declaration. From Korea to Panama, all of our wars have been not only illegal, but in defiance of the Constitution. Yet our so-called conservatives speak sternly of the necessity of a strict construction of the Constitution when, in the interest of stealing money, they have long since abandoned it. Now, through their Supreme Court, they are extinguishing slowly but surely the Bill of Rights with such loosely constructed endorsements as that of preventative detention, which I think 3 years ago nicely put an end to due process. Presently, the Japanese finance our government's deficit through the purchase of treasury bonds. But I don't think this will continue much longer. The Japanese don't like us. Worse for our pride, they don't respect us. They are making financial arrangements elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Europeans are forming a more perfect union without us. They regard our society as a sort of joke, good for making fun movies like Rambo and junk food, but hopeless at making cars or even money in the real world market. Lately, our corporate oligarchs have become alarmed by the breakup of the nation state almost everywhere. Since the nation state, as we know it, is a 19th century invention, I feel no sorrow at its demise. But those with orderly minds, eager to impose absolute order on others, are dismayed by the refusal of Hispanics, say, not to learn English, or Armenians who don't want to be Russians, or Quebecians who don't want to be Canadian, and so on. I think this sudden worldwide desire for tribal identity is healthy, if only because our masters don't. In fact, they have made it almost impossible for us to use the word race for fear of being smeared by their media as racist, something they are, but their critics are not. Yet we are all racist to the extent that any of us feels that he belongs to a tribe, whether it be one of color or religion or some sort of shared identity. If anything, the coming together of people in minority groups is the most significant phenomenon of our times, and it is much feared by rulers everywhere. As a result, we are now faced with two simultaneous movements. One is centrifugal, that is a rushing away from the iron order of a nation state like the Soviet Union, or an equally unnatural category like heterosexuality, which was invented as recently as 1930. Before that, people just idled along. Our corporate masters, like their bureaucratic equivalents to the East, are currently in a state all their own of nervous breakdown. Because everywhere there is a centrifugal, spontaneous movement against concentrated, centralized power. Personally, I see this not as a sign of breakdown in the world, but a sign of spontaneous human good sense. Besides, simultaneously, there is a centripetal force at work, a coming together of autonomous units for certain shared ends, hence the common market in Europe, which will be formed under a loose sort of confederation like that of Switzerland or the United States before Lincoln. The benefits of a common currency and joint environmental action can be shared by a great many tribes or races that choose willingly to cooperate. So, on the one hand, in order to retain individuality, a healthy flight from the center, and on the other, a healthy coming together freely to make a more perfect life for the residents of the common planet. But should centripetal forces defeat centrifugal longings, then welcome to the ant-hill society and to our inglorious common death on a speck of used-up celestial matter. Our political debate, what little there is, can never speak of the future except in terms of the past, and never suggest any sort of planning, because planning is godless and atheistic. So in absolutely conservative and backward-looking terms, I shall now present a winning formula to restore the Republic to the good old days by moving boldly forward into the past. There's room. I would invoke the spirit of Henry Clay. I expected that silence. Thanks to our educational system. Know not what your banner is. Thanks to our educational system, no one knows who Henry Clay is, but for... Yeah, close. But he can be, for political purposes, he can first be explained, then trotted out as a true America firster who felt that it was the task of government to make internal improvements, to spend money on education and on the enlargement of the nation's economic plant. Clay, translated in modern terms, would have us abandon all military pretensions on the grounds that we are too small and too poor a country to act as a global policeman. He would also suggest that we police ourselves first and leave, terrible thought, Nicaragua, say, to the people who live there. Yes, Clay could be called an isolationist, and what's wrong with that? As our economic failure is making us more and more isolated from the rest of the industrialized world. So let's use this quiet time to restore... You never know what's going to happen at Berkeley. Moral rearmament has struck again, I have a feeling. Let us use this quiet time to restore our economic health by taking $200 or $300 billion from military procurement, not to mention feathers from the corporate nest, and put it into education, into finding new ways of training and utilizing the workforce, and new ways of preserving or restoring earth and air and water. This does not seem to me to be too ambitious a program. Also, ideologically, it is absolutely, even sublimely, reactionary and therefore saleable. But the highly progressive military, industrial, political complex that rules us will not easily let go. The war on communism is being replaced by the war on drugs. Ominously, our garrison state is now turning inward in order to create a police state. Currently, close to 1 million Americans are in prison or under constraint, the largest number per capita in the industrialized world. So at last, we are first at something. But the administration is more ambitious for us. They want to reactivate old army camps so that they can house drug users as well as pushers. Of course, we could legalize drugs and get rid of most of the problem, but where's the money in that? serious question. Do you want a patriarchal state? Good. And I don't mean a matriarchal one either. Think about it. Do you want the government to decide what you eat or drink, with whom or how you associate? You may not for yourself, but the average citizen tends to think that they ought to be totally controlled, which is why the polls seem to tell us that a patriarchal state is really what a majority of Americans would like. If that is the case, then let's just forget about 1776 and 1789 and Henry Clay and his disciple Lincoln. Forget them all, do as you're told, look at television 8 hours a day and believe what they tell you. Join the Hate of the Month Club. This month it's Iraq, next month it'll be Japan again. Have we really lost the great experiment? I don't think so. So, this evening I began with Jefferson, as did the country, and I end with his great injunction that should all else fail, the tree of liberty must still be nourished with blood, if necessary, of tyrants and of patriots. So let us come together as patriots, but not patriarchs, and restore what was, reform what is, reveal to a doubting world what we still can be.
Is actually a single-party system with two wings. The only difference between the two wings is that the Democrats tend to be conservative and the Republicans tend to be reactionary.
Gore Vidal was born in 1925 at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where his father was the first aviation instructor. Vidal began writing at an early age. His early works include his first novel, Williwan, written in 1946, and his award-winning play, The Best Man, written in 1960. He is probably best known for his series of historical novels that deal with American life as viewed by one family over generations. These include Burr, Lincoln, Empire, Hollywood, and Washington, D.C. In 1993, his work entitled United States, Essays from 1952 to 1992 won the National Book Award. A great orator and storyteller, Gore Vidal is truly an American original. Gore Vidal gave the following talk as the Carter administration came to a close and as the first Reagan administration was just beginning. He addresses the State of the Union in 1981 in a speech entitled The Decline and Rebirth of the American Republic.
This is a fairly new talk that I have. The rebirth part was very difficult for me. So I've done it on 3x5 cards. Remember those from the last campaign? How the candidate would say, "Hello, I'm George Bush." Then there came the moment when Jimmy Carter said about Reagan, he said, "You just can't go in there and talk to Brezhnev and these people with your 3x5 cards." And Carter was reading from them at the same time. The greatest reader of cards in my lifetime was a president we used to have called Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower always read his cards with a real sense of discovery. And as a matter of fact, he won the election in '52 with against Adlai Stevenson. We're having a war with Korea at the time, and Eisenhower was droning along through his speech, and he said, "And if elected president, I will go to Korea." And the poor old thing had to go to Korea. He got elected. There were no golf courses, and he was in a rage. Now, I am going to be obliged to read some of this, but I promise you that I will look up from time to time in order to give an air of spontaneity, because there are a great many facts here. First, I'd like to get the statistics over with, because I find that even the brightest eye tends to glaze over when statistics are mentioned, so I will fire a few in as vivacious a way as I can. Today we have 12% inflation. We have nearly 8% unemployment. We have dropped to 10th place in the entire world when it comes to per capita income. And we have an industrial productivity rate that is the lowest in the Western world. We have the smallest voter turnout of any Western democracy. 49% of those qualified to vote did not vote for president last November, and I was one of them. Who votes and who doesn't? Well, of that half of the electorate which never votes, 75% are blue-collar and service workers. Of that half that does vote, 48% are blue-collar and service workers. Now, if the 48% of the half who vote join the 75% of the half which does not vote, there would be a large American Labor Party, something that every democratic country has, but we do not. Statistics like this tell us a story that is never put into words by our professional politicians and by their shadows in the media. Despite the eloquence of our 16th president, we have never had a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The founding fathers did not want such a government, and our current rulers do not want such a government. Whether government by the people is a good thing or not, we can argue about. What is not arguable is that the United States has never been what we have pretended to be, a democratic republic. From the beginning, we have been an oligarchical republic, and the power has always been in the hands of those whom Alexander Hamilton referred to as the rich and the well-born. The people at large have never been included in the political process. Our two-party system is actually a single-party system with two wings. One wing is called Republican, the other is called Democratic. The only difference between the two wings is that the Democrats tend to be conservative and the Republicans tend to be reactionary. That is, the Democrats will sometimes pretend that they prefer human rights to property rights, while the Republicans would rather die than be hypocritical. Meanwhile, half the electorate ignores the entire political process. Now, there can be no change in what we have under the present system because the interests of most people are not going to be represented, and so they do not vote. When the going was good, there weren't too many complaints. There was enough for almost everybody. But now that we are a declining power in the world, questions are being asked. Why do we have this system? Where did it start? What did the inventors of the Constitution really have in mind? Well, the answer to that last question is simple: the protection of property. In the Declaration of Independence, the key phrase was, in the original document, life, liberty, and property, a phrase taken from the philosopher Locke. But Thomas Jefferson always got nervous when a spade was being called a spade, so he changed the word property to the pursuit of happiness, which has got to be about the looniest goal ever set for a republic. After all, the Zodiac Killer could claim that he was pursuing happiness in his own energetic way. Now, it is not generally known that the division between rich and poor in the United States is the greatest in the Western world, with the exception of France. But then a lot of important things are not generally known. For instance, I noticed in an LA Times poll recently, 71% of the people think that we have the highest standard of living in the world. We don't. 9 countries are now ahead of us, and a dozen others seem to be catching up. But since it might be disturbing for our people to be told such things, they're not exactly featured by the media or by the politicians. After all, is it not true, in the immortal words of Spiro Agnew, the United States is still the greatest nation in the country? I miss him. And they all write novels. The root of our current troubles is the Constitution of the United States. The Founding Fathers feared two things: monarchy and democracy. They wanted a government that would make it difficult for any man to become dictator and impossible for the people at large to influence a government whose principal task was the protection of the property of the men who already had it. That is why the original Constitution called for a House of Representatives to be elected by those white men over 21 who could meet the property qualifications of the various states, a Senate to be appointed by the state legislatures, a president to be chosen not by the people at large, but by the managers of the different states. In 1787, democracy was a non-starter at Philadelphia, while civil rights were entirely ignored until the next year, when that unsung hero, George Mason of Virginia, tacked the Bill of Rights onto the Constitution. So freedom of speech, assembly, petition, freedom from a state religion, these were the sublime afterthoughts of Mr. George Mason. He himself was pretty skeptical about the new republic. This government, he said in 1787, will set out a moderate aristocracy, which is exactly what it did. Mason thought that it would then develop either into a monarchy or into an oppressive aristocracy. We might say that 2 centuries later we have a bit of both, but we still do not have a democracy. At the beginning, it was feared that the popularly elected House of Representatives would take over the government because that house dominated the money supply. But the first wild card in the constitutional deck was not the House of Representatives, it was the Supreme Court. The court was never given the right to review, much less override, actions of the Congress or of the President. In fact, Article 3 of the Constitution gives the court all the usual duties of an English court of law, but like an English court, subject always to the popularly elected House and to, quote, such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make, unquote. It was, as we remember from history school, it was Chief Justice John Marshall who seized for the court the power to review acts of Congress. And that was in 1803 in the famous Marbury versus Madison. Marshall declared that an act of the Congress was unconstitutional, but he did nothing about it. He simply set a precedent. 54 years later, the court, eager as always to protect property, this time in the form of the slave Dred Scott, who had run away from his master, the court declared unconstitutional the Missouri Compromise, and with that harebrained decision, the Civil War was inevitable. Since then, the Supreme Court has behaved with ever-increasing recklessness, striking down acts of that Congress, which is its constitutional master, while behaving generally as if it were a legislative body. Although the Supreme Court is seldom wise, it is often witty. When the 14th Amendment sternly forbade the state to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the process of law, the court joyously interpreted the word person to mean corporation, thereby helping the robber barons to pull off their capers and avoid jail and taxes. As the population of the United States increased, the franchise has now been extended to include everyone over 18. So in theory, we now have a democracy, but in practice, we have the same oligarchy that we had at the very beginning. And that explains why, after 2 centuries, we have never been able to develop political parties. There are no parties now in existence that represent the actual interests of a highly varied and complex people. Publicists for our system have always said that the genius of the so-called two-party arrangement is that it never divides along ideological lines. Now there is a sneaking suspicion that not only does this arrangement lack any ideology, but it also lacks any ideas. There is no energy program. There is no coherent foreign policy. There is no notion how to compete industrially with other countries. In this century, the only thing which the ownership of the country really understands is the preparation for war. Actual wars they try to avoid, since they tend to lose them. And they lose these wars because it is very hard to get people who have no loyalty to a country that excludes them from power to fight for that country. Or as Muhammad Ali so wisely said, "I got nothing against them Viet Cong." Meanwhile, we are told that our presidents cannot govern. They are blocked by Congress, by the bureaucracy, by the special interests, by the moon in Saturn. Now, this is all nonsense, except for the last. Our presidents have the power to do just about anything that they want to do. Through a series of executive orders, Johnson and Nixon kept us at war in Vietnam without a declaration of war by Congress, and was certainly without the support of the people at large. Finally, after 8 years of war by decree, Congress threatened to turn off the money. And since the president, if not Dr. Kissinger, was worn out, the war came to an end. Yet even today, whenever a president wants to overthrow a foreign government, spy on an American citizen, kill a foreign leader, he can do so through his strong right arm, the CIA. Although the Congress has the privilege of giving the CIA some $8 billion a year, they may not really investigate it or control it. The CIA is the president's personal hit squad, and no president will ever give it up. Presently, I notice in Congress, the CIA would like to be allowed, legally for a change, to spy on Americans in our own country. I am sure Congress will let them do that. To date, there have been more than 15,000 executive orders, and each has the same power domestically as an act of Congress, even when it usurps the rights of the Congress. For instance, it was by an executive agreement that Carter broke off relations with Taiwan without the Senate's advice or consent. It is interesting that Congress has never once overruled an executive order, while the Supreme Court has never questioned the principle of rule by decree. And I think that nicely takes care of the so-called famous checks and balances of our old Constitution. Every 4 years, we elect a dictator. In practice, as well as in theory, he can do pretty much what he wants to do. Luckily for us, he doesn't ever seem to want to do much of anything. If Carter had really wanted an energy program in 1977, he could have had it through a series of executive orders. But he didn't want it. He would have had to tax gasoline or ration it. And this would have cost him votes in 1980. So he threw his program at Congress, which did not want an energy program either, because they also had to face the electorate. So nothing was done, and Carter could blame Congress, and Congress could blame Carter. During the last campaign, we heard a lot about a balanced budget. Yet every politician knows that the federal budget can never be balanced. I should add, of course, under the present system of government. This is the way things really are or seem to be as of today. The current budget for 1981 is $739 billion, which will mean a deficit of anywhere from $30 to $60 billion. Mr. Reagan would like to cut the overall budget by some $30 billion, while increasing the defense budget by, yes, $30 billion, in order to contain the menace of monolithic international atheistic and godless communism, which is forever on the march even as we sit here today. Now, all of this nonsense is designed to fool the people. The Pentagon has more money than it knows what to do with. As for cutting the federal budget, Congress and the presidents have seen to it that practically nothing can ever be legally cut. Of the total budget, 79% now represents service on the debt and transfer payments to people in the forms of Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps, and the maintenance of former presidents, which is a growth industry.
You've been listening to a talk by Gore Vidal.
Overwhelmed with awe to consider that I'd be speaking here right after General Westmoreland and G. Gordon Liddy. As I am neither a war criminal nor a Watergate criminal, this is a bit of a come down, but for you. I spent a bit of time this summer with America's greatest mind, Johnny Carson, and Johnny said, have you noticed how whenever Reagan is asked a question, he always looks down and then slowly looks up and says, well, he said, why does he look down? I said, those are the old Westerns. They used to do the dialogue at your feet, and you'd look down to get your next line. So he's looking down a little desperately to see what is in store for him and us. But there's something very wrong with the United States of America today, and there has been something very wrong for quite some time. We have a one-party system that is the creation of those great financial interests that have controlled the country off and on, but mostly on since 1786. Our single-party system is currently divided into two factions. One is called Republican and the other is called Democratic. This division is supposed to give us a sense of choice at election time. But it's sort of on the order of painkiller X is better than painkiller Y, and yet each, as we all know, is aspirin. So in the absence of political parties, it is not surprising that we have no politics as opposed to elections. And those of us who do vote provide a kind of Greek chorus to a drama over which no one has much control. I put this down, the fact that people keep getting very blank when I say we have no politics, but we have elections. Most people in the country think an election is a political event. It isn't, particularly if you have a single-party system. And thanks to an educational system which teaches conformity, when it teaches anything at all, United States persons, I would say, are roughly divided between conservatives and reactionaries. The reactionaries enjoy listening to the Republican faction sing the battle hymn of the Republic, and conservatives like to listen to the Democrats croon "Happy Days Are Here Again." But in the absence of real politics, the phenomenon is that half of those qualified to vote never vote at all, and that there are now signs that those who do vote are beginning to realize that it makes no difference who wins any election, because taxes and inflation will continue to increase as our real income decreases.